This past New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2024, I decided to do something different. My brother Lucas had told me about an old, abandoned train station a few miles outside of our town in upstate New York. It was a spot known for its eerie atmosphere, and locals often shared ghost stories about it. Some said they'd heard phantom train whistles. Others claimed to have seen shadowy figures wandering the platform. Lucas, being the thrill seeker he was, suggested we spend New Year's Eve there, just the two of us, to see if the stories were true. I wasn't exactly sold on the idea, but the prospect of ringing in the new year with a unique experience, and maybe some creepy stories to tell, was too intriguing to pass up. We left for the station just after 9 p.m., bundling up against the biting cold. The snowstorm that had rolled in earlier that day was still raging, and the drive was slow and treacherous. By the time we arrived, the wind had picked up, and the station was barely visible through the swirling snow. The building was exactly as Lucas had described, dilapidated and weathered by time. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were boarded up or shattered. Despite its state, there was something oddly beautiful about it, as if it had been frozen in time. We parked the car a short distance away and trudged through the snow toward the platform. The air was unnervingly silent, save for the crunch of our boots and the occasional howl of the wind. Lucas was grinning ear to ear, clearly in his element, while I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that crept over me with every step. Inside, the station was even creepier. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, and the floor was littered with debris. The ticket booth, still partially intact, stood in one corner, its glass pane cracked and fogged over. We set up camp in what used to be the waiting area, lighting a small portable lantern for warmth and light. For the first hour, nothing happened. Lucas and I swapped stories and jokes, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the mood began to shift. The wind outside grew louder, and the building seemed to groan under its weight. At exactly 11:45, we heard the first sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic tapping, like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. Lucas dismissed it as the wind, but I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't seem random. It was deliberate, purposeful. We stood in silence, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the empty station. Then, it stopped abruptly. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the platform. "Maybe someone else is here," Lucas whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously made our way to the platform. The snow had covered the tracks, and the night was pitch black beyond the reach of our beams. The tapping started again, this time accompanied by another sound, a faint, distant whistle. Lucas froze. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. The whistle grew louder, closer, until it sounded as though a train was barreling toward us. But there was no train, only the snow-covered tracks stretching into the darkness. Suddenly, the tapping turned into pounding, coming from the far end of the platform. We swung our flashlights toward the noise, but all we saw was empty space. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a shadow darting between the columns that lined the platform. "Who's there?" Lucas called out, his voice shaky. The shadow froze, then stepped into the light. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His face was pale and expressionless, and his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to go." The man raised a hand and pointed toward the tracks. As if on cue, the whistle sounded again, deafening this time. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and a blinding light appeared in the distance, racing toward us. "Run!" Lucas shouted, grabbing my arm. We bolted back into the station, the sound of the phantom train growing louder with each step. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man watching us, his face still emotionless, as the light of the non-existent train engulfed him. Inside, we barricaded ourselves in the ticket booth, our hearts pounding. The station shook violently, and the whistle was so loud it felt like my ears might burst. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. We stayed huddled in the ticket booth until dawn, too terrified to move. When we finally stepped outside, the platform was empty. There were no footprints, no sign of the man, and the tracks were untouched by anything resembling a train. We never told anyone what happened that night, partly because we knew no one would believe us. But every time I hear a train whistle now, I can't help but wonder if it's real, or if it's the ghostly echo of that night, calling us back to the station. This past New Year's Eve, 2024, my girlfriend Clara and I decided to take a much-needed getaway. The past year had been chaotic for both of us, so when we found a last-minute rental for a cabin deep in the forests of Oregon, it seemed like the perfect way to start fresh. The cabin was advertised as remote, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and nothing but miles of trees surrounding it. That isolation was part of the appeal, or so we thought. The drive out there took most of the afternoon, and by the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The place was cozy but old, with creaky wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen stocked with basic supplies. Clara loved it immediately, snapping pictures for her Instagram despite having no way to post them. I joked that we'd have to mail the photos to our friends like postcards. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets, owls, and the occasional rustle of branches. We lit a fire, made some hot cocoa, and settled in to watch the stars through the cabin's wide front windows. The first few hours were magical, and for a moment, it felt like we'd left all our worries behind. But then, just after 10 p.m., Clara noticed something strange. She pointed out a light in the distance, flickering through the trees. It was faint, like the glow of a lantern or a flashlight, and it seemed to be moving. "Do you think someone else is out there?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. "It's probably just another cabin," I replied, though I knew there weren't supposed to be any within miles of us. Still, I didn't want to ruin the mood by overreacting. The light disappeared a few minutes later, and we tried to laugh it off. But as the hours passed, we both grew restless. Clara kept glancing out the window, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, once soothing, now felt oppressive, its shadows pressing in on all sides. At around 11:30 p.m., the light returned, closer this time. It weaved through the trees, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if whoever was holding it was searching for something or someone. "Okay, that's not normal," Clara whispered, gripping my arm. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Hello?" I called into the darkness. The forest swallowed my voice, offering no reply. The light vanished again, leaving us in an unsettling silence. Clara wanted to call someone, but our phones were useless without service. We decided to lock the doors and wait it out, hoping the morning would bring answers and an end to the creeping dread that had settled over us. As midnight approached, the light returned yet again. But this time, there were two. They moved in tandem, zigzagging through the trees, coming closer with every pass. Clara was panicking now, and I was struggling to keep her calm. "Stay here," I told her, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "I'm going to see what's going on." "Are you insane? You're not going out there," she hissed, pulling me back. But before we could argue further, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but then it grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the cabin like a drumbeat. Clara screamed, and I nearly dropped the poker. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. I shone the flashlight through the windows but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if multiple people were now moving around us. Then, without warning, the front door handle began to rattle. "Go away," I shouted, my voice breaking. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, all was still. Then the back door slammed open. Clara and I both screamed as a gust of icy wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing the fire. In the dim light of the flashlight, I could just make out a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Get out," I yelled, raising the poker. But the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching us, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Clara grabbed my arm, and we bolted for the bedroom. locking the door behind us. We could hear the footsteps again, this time inside the cabin, moving methodically from room to room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the poker. For what felt like hours, we huddled together in the corner, listening as the intruders explored the cabin. Occasionally, we'd hear faint whispers, too muffled to make out. At one point, the doorknob to the bedroom jiggled, but the lock held. Finally, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, the eerie presence, they all vanished, leaving the cabin deathly silent. When we finally mustered the courage to leave the bedroom, we found the cabin in disarray. The back door was wide open, snow piling up on the floor. The furniture had been overturned, and strange symbols had been scratched into the walls. Symbols neither of us recognized. We didn't stick around to investigate. We grabbed our things and left as quickly as possible, driving back to civilization in silence. To this day, we don't know who or what visited us that night. But every time I close my eyes, I see that shadowy figure standing in the doorway, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't locked the bedroom door. Last year, on New Year's Eve 2024, my buddy Travis and I decided to make one final trip before the holiday ended. We'd both had a rough year and thought a short getaway might be the perfect way to hit the reset button. Travis had found a remote Airbnb in a small coastal town in Maine, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It sounded picturesque and peaceful, the ideal place to leave the stress of the year behind. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the winter sun dipped below the horizon. The house was old but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and large bay windows that looked out onto the water. There were no neighbors in sight, just endless cliffs, waves crashing below, and the faint outline of a lighthouse in the distance. The owner, an older man named Mr. Gardner, had left us a note on the kitchen counter. "Enjoy your stay," it read, followed by a warning, "Be mindful of the tides." We didn't think much of it at the time. The place had everything we needed: a roaring fireplace, a well-stocked kitchen, and plenty of space to relax. After unpacking, we cracked open a couple of beers and settled in for the night. As midnight approached, we stepped out onto the porch to watch the waves. The wind was bitterly cold, but the view was worth it. The lighthouse in the distance cast an intermittent glow, illuminating the jagged cliffs below. For a moment, it felt like the perfect way to start the new year. But then, as we were about to head back inside, we noticed something strange. A figure stood on the edge of the cliff, barely visible in the moonlight. They were dressed in dark, tattered clothing, and their posture was unnervingly still. "Do you see that?" Travis whispered, pointing toward the figure. "Yeah," I said, my stomach tightening. "Who the hell stands that close to the edge in weather like this?" We called out, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there, unmoving, as if they hadn't heard us, or were deliberately ignoring us. After a few minutes, the wind picked up, and the figure seemed to vanish into the darkness. "Must have been a hiker or something," Travis said, though he didn't sound convinced. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. The rest of the night was uneventful, and by morning, the strange encounter was almost forgotten. We spent the day exploring the nearby town, grabbing coffee at a local diner and browsing a few antique shops. When we mentioned the figure on the cliff to the waitress at the diner, her face darkened. "You boys shouldn't be out there at night," she said, her voice low. "People say the cliffs are haunted. Folks have seen things, heard things. Best you stay inside after dark." We laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to spook us. But her warning lingered in the back of my mind as we drove back to the house. That evening, the storm rolled in. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows, drowning out all other sounds. Travis and I decided to hunker down with a few drinks and a card game, trying to ignore the eerie atmosphere. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. "Figures," Travis muttered, lighting a couple of candles. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the house feel even more isolated. And then, we heard it, a faint tapping at the window. At first, we thought it was the wind or a loose branch, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. Travis grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the window. The beam caught something that made my blood run cold. A handprint, smeared on the glass from the outside. "Did you do that earlier?" Travis asked, his voice tight. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I haven't even been near that window." We stared at the handprint for what felt like an eternity, our breaths visible in the frigid air. Then, the tapping moved to the front door. Travis and I exchanged a panicked glance. Slowly, he approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the lock. "Don't," I hissed, pulling him back. But it was too late. He flung the door open, flashlight in hand. There was no one there, just the howling wind and the empty porch. But the moment Travis stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind him. I lunged for the handle, yanking it open, only to find the porch empty. "Travis?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The only response was the wind, carrying the faint sound of crashing waves below. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, calling his name over and over. My voice echoed against the cliffs, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as I scanned the area, the beam of the flashlight darting between the trees and the edge of the cliff. And then, I saw him, or at least I thought I did. A figure stood near the lighthouse, motionless in the rain. I ran toward it, slipping and stumbling on the wet grass, but by the time I reached the spot, it was empty. Desperate, I turned back toward the house, and that's when I saw it. The figure from the night before was standing on the edge of the cliff, staring at me. This time, I could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its features were blurred, like a smudged painting, and its hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul. I ran back to the house, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside, hoping to find some sign of Travis. I never did. The police conducted a search but found no evidence of foul play, or even any footprints leading to the cliffs. They suggested he might have fallen, but I knew better. Whatever I saw that night wasn't human, and whatever it was, it took Travis. I left the house that morning, vowing never to return. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, especially on stormy nights. And every so often, I hear the faint tapping of rain against my window, as if it's calling me back to that cursed house. It was New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2024, and I had agreed to dog sit for my friend Dylan, who was heading out of town to celebrate the new year with his girlfriend. Dylan and I didn't hang out often, but when he asked if I could look after his energetic golden retriever, Max, I couldn't say no. His house was only a few blocks away from mine, and since I wasn't much for big parties anymore, it seemed like a good excuse to make a little cash while spending the night in peace. Dylan's house was cozy, tucked away on a quiet street surrounded by tall pines. He gave me the rundown. Feed Max twice a day, walk him at least once, and don't let him on the couch. I settled in early, unpacking my overnight bag in the guest room and spending most of the afternoon scrolling on my phone and throwing Max's favorite squeaky ball across the living room. By the time night fell, I decided to skip the countdown and just watch a movie. The streets outside were eerily quiet, blanketed by fresh snow that muted every sound. Around 9:30 p.m., just as I was halfway through an old thriller, Max perked up suddenly. His ears stood straight, and his tail went stiff. He was staring at the front door, his nose twitching. "What is it, buddy?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though his reaction put me on edge. Then came the knock, light, hesitant, but distinctly deliberate. It was unusual for someone to show up unannounced, especially on New Year's Eve. Max began to growl low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the door. I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing but the darkened street and falling snow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Brushing it off as a prank or a random passerby, I went back to my movie, but Max wouldn't settle. He kept pacing, his growl constant, his nose pressed against the crack beneath the door. Another knock, this time louder. I felt my heart skip. I checked the peephole again. Nothing. No tracks in the fresh snow, no sign of anyone. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. Silence. Max started barking now, the kind of bark that comes from deep instinct, alert, warning, protective. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, ready to call Dylan or even the cops if this kept up. Before I could decide, the sound of footsteps crept around the house. The crunch of snow under heavy boots was unmistakable. Someone was circling the property. I turned off the lights in the living room and moved to the kitchen, trying to keep out of sight. Max followed close behind, his growl vibrating through the quiet house. When I peeked out of the back window, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, was lingering by the back porch, their face obscured by a hood. The doorbell rang. Then came pounding, urgent, almost frantic. Whoever this was wasn't giving up. I grabbed the nearest weapon-like object I could find, a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen drawer. My phone was already in my other hand, trembling as I dialed 911. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" came the operator's calm voice. "There's someone outside," I whispered. "They're banging on the doors and circling the house. I don't know who they are." The operator assured me that police were on their way and instructed me to stay on the line, but before I could reply, the pounding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for Max's growls and the sound of my own breathing. Then, a shattering crash came from the living room. Someone had broken a window. I scrambled to lock myself and Max in the guest room. My heart was racing, and I could hear heavy footsteps inside the house now, deliberate and slow, as if they were searching for something or someone. "Stay quiet," I whispered to Max, though I knew it was futile. His barking was relentless now, a fierce warning that echoed through the room. The footsteps stopped right outside the guest room door. The handle jiggled. "Police are on their way," I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. A low, raspy laugh came from the other side of the door, a sound so chilling it made my blood run cold. Then silence. No more footsteps, no more sounds. Just silence. When the police finally arrived, they found the back door wide open and footprints leading off into the woods behind Dylan's house. Whoever it was had vanished. They left behind nothing but broken glass and an overwhelming sense of unease. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. Dylan had no enemies, and nothing in the house was stolen. But every New Year's Eve since, I can't shake the memory of that laugh and the feeling of being watched from the shadows. New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2024, was supposed to be uneventful for me. My best friend, Kevin, had invited me to stay at his family's secluded vacation cabin in the woods of northern Maine. The plan was simple. Kevin, his girlfriend Sarah, and a few of our mutual friends would celebrate the new year there. But Kevin's plans changed at the last minute, and everyone else bailed. Suddenly, I was left alone with a decision: skip the trip or enjoy a few days of peace and quiet in the snowy wilderness. I chose the latter, thinking it would be a rare opportunity to disconnect from the world. I packed my bags and arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. The property was breathtaking, an A-frame structure surrounded by towering pines, the snow glistening under the soft orange glow of the fading light. When I stepped inside, the cabin was just as cozy as I'd remembered. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the smell of pine filled the air. Kevin's family had stocked the place with firewood, and the cupboards were full of canned goods and snacks. After unpacking, I lit a fire and settled in, flipping through the movies Kevin had left on the coffee table. By 8 p.m., the snowstorm that had been forecasted arrived. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows and piling snow against the door. I'd always found storms oddly comforting, so I wrapped myself in a blanket and started a movie. It wasn't until the power flickered off and on that I started to feel uneasy. The first strange thing happened just after 9 p.m. I was halfway through my second movie when I heard a sharp knock at the front door. It was startling, given how remote the cabin was. Who would trek through a snowstorm to knock on a stranger's door? I paused the movie and approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No answer. I peered through the peephole but saw only swirling snow. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it started. Shrugging it off, I returned to the couch, telling myself it was probably just the wind or a branch hitting the door. But 10 minutes later, the knocking started again, this time louder and more insistent. My stomach churned as I approached the door a second time. Again, no one was there. I stepped outside, the icy wind biting my face as I scanned the property. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there. Unease settled in my chest as I locked the door and double-checked the windows. By 10 p.m., the storm was raging, and the cabin had grown eerily quiet. The fire crackled softly, but every creak of the old wood seemed amplified in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed something odd. The front door's deadbolt was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it after the second round of knocking. My heart raced as I twisted the lock back into place. Had I imagined it? Another knock. This time, it came from the back door. I froze. The back door was accessible only by a narrow path that should have been buried under snow by now. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be Kevin, surprising me with an unannounced visit? Or maybe a neighbor, stranded in the storm? I grabbed the fire poker and crept to the back door. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. Just the sound of the wind and the faint creak of snow underfoot. Then, a face appeared in the small, frosted window of the back door. It was pale, almost ghostly, with sunken eyes and an expressionless mouth. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity before vanishing into the darkness. My legs felt like lead as I backed away, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Kevin, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell tower. Panic set in as I realized how isolated I truly was. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help. The knocking started again, this time on the front door. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, clutching the fire poker as the sound grew louder and more aggressive. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was pounding, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside was trying to break the door down. The fire in the hearth dimmed suddenly, and the temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, deeper. The pounding stopped abruptly, and silence enveloped the cabin. I crept to the window and peered outside. Through the snow, I could just make out the figure of a person standing at the edge of the woods. They were motionless, their face obscured by the shadows of the trees. Then, they stepped forward, followed by another figure, and another. Soon, there were 5 of them, all standing in a line, their faces pale and blank, staring directly at the cabin. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it around the cabin, half expecting to see one of the figures inside with me. A loud crash came from upstairs. I nearly dropped the flashlight as I whipped it toward the staircase. The sound of footsteps echoed above me, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was inside. I ran to the back door, wrenching it open and plunging into the snowstorm without looking back. The icy wind stung my face as I sprinted toward the tree line, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't stop running until I reached a small hunting cabin Kevin had mentioned during one of our conversations. The door was unlocked, and I bolted inside, barricading it with a heavy chair. I stayed there until morning, shivering and clutching the fire poker, waiting for the figures to find me. When the storm cleared, I made my way back to Kevin's cabin. The snow around the house was untouched, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But the front door was wide open, and the fire in the hearth had been relit. I never told Kevin what happened that night, and I've never gone back to that cabin. But every New Year's Eve, I can't help but feel like they're still out there, waiting for me to return. Last New Year's Eve, 2024, my cousin Eric and I decided to take a break from the chaos of the city and spend the weekend at our family's old hunting lodge in the Appalachian Mountains. The place hadn't been used in years, but it held a lot of nostalgic value for both of us. We figured it would be the perfect spot to disconnect, reminisce about the past, and toast to the new year. The lodge was a rustic, 2-story building nestled deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. We arrived just before sundown, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The air was crisp, and a thick blanket of snow coated the forest floor. Despite its age, the lodge still had an old-world charm, with its stone fireplace, wooden beams, and vintage furniture. We spent the first couple of hours cleaning up, sweeping out cobwebs, wiping down dusty surfaces and airing out the place. Once we had a fire roaring in the hearth, the lodge felt warm and inviting. Eric pulled out a bottle of whiskey, and we spent the evening swapping stories and catching up. By 11 p.m., the snowstorm that had been forecasted hit with full force. The wind howled through the trees, and the windows rattled in their frames. Still, the fire was warm, and the whiskey was doing its job of keeping us in good spirits. That was until we heard the first noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. A rhythmic thudding, like someone knocking on wood. We paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped. Eric laughed it off, suggesting it was just a branch hitting the roof. I wasn't so sure. A few minutes later, the sound came again, louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from outside, near the back of the lodge. "Stay here," Eric said, grabbing a flashlight. I followed him despite his protests, unwilling to be left alone. We stepped out onto the back porch, the cold air biting through our jackets. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but falling snow and shadows. That's when we saw them, footprints, leading from the tree line straight to the porch steps. They were fresh, the snow around them still loose and powdery, but whoever had made them was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe it's a hunter," Eric muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. We retreated inside, locking the doors and windows. The unease was palpable now, the warmth of the fire doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in my chest. Midnight came and went. We planned to watch the countdown on Eric's phone, but neither of us felt like celebrating anymore. The storm outside had intensified, and the lodge felt increasingly claustrophobic. At 12:15, the power went out. Darkness engulfed the room, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. Eric lit a lantern while I grabbed the flashlight. The storm outside seemed to grow quieter, the wind replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, the knocking began again. But this time, it wasn't just from one spot. It came from all around the lodge, on the walls, the windows, even the roof. A chorus of thuds that seemed to surround us entirely. "Who's out there?" Eric shouted, his voice trembling. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness. We sat in silence, clutching our makeshift weapons. Rusty crowbar for Eric and a fire poker for me. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Just as we began to relax, there was a loud crash from upstairs. Eric and I exchanged a panicked glance. The upstairs had been locked. We hadn't even gone up there since arriving. Gathering what courage we could, we climbed the creaking staircase, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands. The upstairs hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms closed. But at the far end of the hall, the attic door was ajar. Neither of us remembered opening it. "You check it out," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. "No way," I hissed back. "You're the one with the crowbar." Reluctantly, Eric led the way, his movements slow and deliberate. The attic stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed. I followed, every muscle in my body tense. The attic was freezing, our breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. Boxes and old furniture were scattered haphazardly, casting long, twisted shadows. At first, it seemed empty, but then the flashlight caught something, movement, near the far corner. "Who's there?" Eric demanded, raising the crowbar. The shadows shifted, and a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wild, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Before we could react, he lunged at us. Eric swung the crowbar, narrowly missing as the man ducked and bolted down the attic stairs. We gave chase, but by the time we reached the main floor, he was gone. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in. We called the police, who arrived hours later once the storm had let up. They searched the lodge and the surrounding woods, but found no sign of the man. The footprints leading away from the lodge vanished into the snow. Eric and I left the lodge the next morning, vowing never to return. To this day, I can't explain how the man got into the attic or what he wanted. But every New Year's Eve, I think about that wild smile and the sound of his footsteps echoing through the lodge.